just found a really nice rose bush covered in particularly mushy rose hips, and I just want to show you my favourite way of eating them, because if you want to go and scrape all the pips out or make them into rosehip syrup, which is what I'm going to do, massive faff, but if you're very careful you can squeeze them like a spot and you get this nugget of pure rose hippie goodness. It's really good for you as well. For a worthwhile amount of rosehip syrup, you're going to need at least 1 kilogram of rosehips, ideally more. They could be firm, newly ripe ones. They could be ones that have had a bit of frost on them and they've gone a duller red and started to wrinkle. It doesn't really matter as long as they haven't gone a brownish red, which means they're rotting. Best time to pick is around November, but you can sometimes find them even into January. If you want to soften them, you can also freeze them. That's no problem at all. Rosehip syrup has become particularly synonymous with wartime in Britain. Children were even given a day off school just to pick rosehips, and the syrup was then given to them as a sort of daily tonic to stave off scurvy during the food rationing era. To preserve as much vitamin C as possible, you need to denature enzymes inside the rosehips, which start to break down the vitamin C as soon as the rosehips are cut up. So this is why I've got the water boiling, and as soon as I can, I'll chuck the minced rosehips in there. You could chop them up by hand, but it takes forever. You could also use an old-fashioned mincing machine, but the rosehips do tend to ping everywhere. Now, as you're going to see, making rosehip syrup is a bit of a fiddle. So why bother? Well, it's simple really. It's absolutely delicious, as well as being quite good for you. It's great on pancakes, it's great on yoghurt, it's great drizzled on top of fruit, it's great on your Weetabix, and you can also make it into a pretty tasty liqueur, which I'll go through. So it is worth the effort. A little goes a long way, and if you put it in small sterilised bottles rather than great big ones, it will keep for a long time as well. By the time you've picked your rosehips and gathered a fair number of scratches in the process, you won't want to waste any of the pulp or juice. So make sure you scrape out the mixer well and give it a rinse out if possible. All the rosehips are in the pan, they're bubbling away nicely. You want to keep them on a kind of a low simmer. If you boil them too hard, you can start destroying some of the vitamin C and stuff. So just simmer them to break them down. I've got a clean pan here for the next stage, because once you've filtered the juice and the pulp and got all of the little hairs out, you want to make damn sure you don't contaminate one with the other, because then you filtered it for nothing. So I've also got a bowl and my jelly bag, which is actually one I made. You can buy them, just make sure it's a really, really fine one for doing this. This one was made out of some old voile, don't know how you're supposed to say it, curtains or something that I'd obtained from somewhere, and just make the seams really strong. So if you have a sewing machine, sew it and then zigzag stitch it as well. You could even run and fell it if you're up to that, because we're going to try and get every single last bit of pulp out of these, and so you'll be squeezing the juice through it quite hard, and if it's not strong enough, it'll just break, and then you have to sieve the whole lot again. Now, looking in here, I can see that it's broken down quite a lot. There are no big bits in there, so I think that will probably do. Down there like that. And quite simply, okay, now we're actually going to be returning this pulp to the pot and boiling again with more water, just to make sure we get every last bit of goodness. So
Don't worry too much about getting everything out of the pan.
Now, at this point, you need to find a way of hanging up the jelly bag so that it can drain. You can turn a chair upside down and prop it up on a work table and put the bowl on the underside of the seat and hang a crossbar across what would be the legs. That can work, or find some other way of doing it. I have a cupboard door handle that I like to use. Squeeze as much juice as you can out of the pulp, but don't worry too much because in fact you're going to boil up this pulp again and collect a second load of juice. So once you've extracted as much juice as you can, return it all to the pan, add more water and boil again. Once you've boiled up the pulp for a second time, you need to filter it again and then refilter both loads of juice just to make sure you've got all of the pips out. Then return it all to the clean pan and start it boiling. You need to boil it quite hard because you're trying to reduce it by at least a third, ideally a half. Once it's begun to reduce, you'll see that by the tide mark on the side of the pan, you need to add a ridiculous amount of sugar. After all, you are making a syrup. I don't usually measure it, but it's approximately 500 grams per litre of unreduced juice. You need to boil the mixture hard until it starts to reduce and become more like this. It'll have a constant rolling sort of translucent look. You're going to need your bottles soon, so make sure they are clean and sterilised by heat, using an oven or by sitting them in a pan of boiling water. Once the syrup is reduced enough, you can pour it into your bottles. Funnel makes this job easier. I've even sterilised the corks. Now at this point you could add some potassium sorbate, which is a food preservative, or another food preservative, but I chose not to. That's 3 bottles of syrup done for normal purposes, putting on pancakes, making into hot toddies, taking as a preventative during the winter. Generally tasty stuff. It will keep for a while, but once the bottle's open it needs to be finished within a couple of weeks, and it really should be kept in the fridge. However, you can also use the syrup to make a liqueur. Really simple, just take the spirit of your choice and mix it about 50-50. I read somewhere about a bunch of school children experimenting with making rosehip lollies, and I thought I'd give it a go. Take any remaining syrup and continue boiling it down. You need to be very careful, obviously, that it doesn't burn, especially at the bottom of the pan. I dusted the bottom of a tin with icing sugar to stop the stuff sticking and added some spices to the syrup. You need to keep boiling the mixture until it forms thin strings with little beads of sugar along them when dangled from a spoon or whatever you're using to stir it. Drops of the mixture should also set hard when dropped into a saucer of water.
Look at that. I've made rosehip lollies.
None of the sweets I made lasted long enough to be used for the purpose, but they would have made good cough drops. At the same time as picking the rosehips, I also picked several kilograms of hawthorn berries, or haws. I wanted to show you the process for making the traditional self-setting fruit leather from them, but I also used the remaining pulp to make a fruit leather with the final load of rosehip puree, which was extracted by squeezing it through a jelly bag twice. These were picked with a berry comb, which unfortunately does pick a lot of the stems as well. So the first job is to go through them, pick out any obviously rotten ones and get rid of as many stems and leaves as possible. Next job is to squish them up. Best done with your hands rather than a food mixer, which would break up the pips as well. Some years the berries are very, very dry, in which case you'll need to add a bit of water to help get the pips out. Next job, and definitely the most fiddly bit, is to try and get rid of as many pips as possible. So the old-fashioned way would be to simply squeeze it between your fingers and collect the pulp that escapes. As with the rosehips, I did keep the pips and things that would otherwise be chucked to see if I could extract any more from them by different methods. A sieve also works very well, but it will need to be quite a strong one. I actually broke my sieve doing this. Because the mixture sets naturally, you need to work fairly quickly and squeeze the pips out before it sets. It might be best to work in batches because of this. The set mixture then needs to be sliced up and put on a rack for drying. Since I was really keen not to waste anything, I boiled up the rosehip again and really squeezed it through a very fine mesh jelly bag twice. I did the same with the hawthorn berries, mixing with cold water rather than boiling them, and that gave me 2 sets of pulp that I then mixed together and made into fruit leather, which was probably one of the best I've ever made. The possibilities really are endless, and the basic principles of making jams, chutneys, jellies and fruit leathers are fairly universal across all fruits. It doesn't take much practice to get the hang of. So get out there and make use of whatever's in season.